On the evening of her granddaughter's 18th birthday, a woman in a worn wool coat was told there was no table for her in a restaurant she had built with her own two hands 50 years before. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She stood in the warm golden light of the lobby, a small wrapped gift under her arm, and asked politely for the reservation under her name. The floor manager looked at her coat, at her flat, sensible shoes, at the plastic bag holding the gift, and told her, gently and cruelly, that she must be at the wrong place. Behind him, above the host stand, hung a large framed black and white photograph of a young woman standing in the doorway of a tiny diner on the day it opened. That young woman was Eleanor. Her name was carved in gold over the door. It was printed on every menu, every wine list, every paycheck in the building. And not one person working that floor had any idea. Before the night was over, someone was going to learn the most expensive lesson of their career. If you've ever been judged by what you were wearing before anyone bothered to learn your name, stay with me. This one is for you. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Eleanor Whitfield was 74 years old, and she had not always owned restaurants. She had started with one. 50 years ago, she and her husband Samuel had scraped together everything they had and bought a failing 12-stool diner on a corner where the rent was cheap because nobody wanted to be there. Samuel cooked. Eleanor ran the floor. They could not afford tablecloths, so she pressed paper napkins into neat folds and set them like they were linen. What they could afford was this. Every single person who walked through that door was treated like they mattered, whether they ordered a full dinner or a cup of coffee they nursed for 2 hours because it was warm inside and cold out. That was the whole idea. That was the only idea, and it worked. One diner became two. Two became a small group. The small group became the Rosewood. A name people now said in a certain hushed way, the kind of place where a table had to be booked weeks ahead, and the wine cost more than Eleanor and Samuel used to make in a month. Samuel had passed 6 years ago. Eleanor still came to the flagship on quiet evenings, and she still did the one thing she had always done. She came in plain clothes, unannounced, and watched how the staff treated a person who looked like she had nowhere important to be. Because that, she believed, was the only honest measure of a place. Not how you treat the guest in the good coat. How you treat the one in the worn one. She had learned that lesson young, and she had learned it the hard way. At 23, newly married and dressed in the best dress she owned, which was not very good, she had been turned away from a fine restaurant on her anniversary while the couple behind her was waved through. She had stood on the sidewalk and cried, and then she had made herself a promise. If she ever built a place of her own, no one would ever feel on her floor the way she felt on that sidewalk. Tonight was special. Tonight her granddaughter, Katie, was turning 18, and Katie had chosen the Rosewood, not knowing her grandmother owned it. Eleanor had never made a show of it. Katie thought they were splurging for one unforgettable night. Eleanor had let her think so, because she loved watching the girl's face light up. The floor manager's name was Julian Reeve. He was in his 40s, precise, tailored, with the smooth confidence of a man who had decided long ago that his job was to protect the restaurant from the wrong sort of people. He had a talent for making contempt sound like courtesy. "I'm afraid I don't see anything under that name," Julian said, not looking at his screen. "We're fully committed this evening. Perhaps you're thinking of somewhere else. There's a lovely little place 2 blocks down that might suit you better." "The reservation was made this morning," Eleanor said. "For 2, Whitfield, ma'am." Julian's smile thinned. "This is a private, high-end establishment. Our guests have certain expectations. I'm sure you understand." He said it just loud enough for the couple waiting behind her to hear, and he let his eyes travel once more over the coat, the shoes, the plastic bag, so that everyone would understand exactly what he meant. A young hostess named Chloe stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She just looked down at the stand and let it happen, because Julian was her manager, and going along was easier than standing up. Katie had gone very still beside her grandmother. She was 18 tonight, in the nicest dress she owned, and she had been so excited an hour ago, and now she was watching a man in a beautiful suit tell her grandmother she wasn't good enough to sit down. Her cheeks were burning, she said quietly. "We can just go. It's fine. Let's just go." "It is not fine," Eleanor said, but she said it gently and only to Katie. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart." "Neither did I." Julian had already turned his attention to the well-dressed couple behind them. "So sorry for the wait. Right this way." It was a young server named Rosa who broke the moment. Rosa Alvarez was 22 and had been on the job 4 months, and she had been carrying a tray of water glasses across the lobby when she saw the old woman's face and the girl's burning cheeks, and something in her simply refused to keep walking. She set the tray down. She crossed to Eleanor, and she pulled out a chair at the small unbooked table by the window, the one they saved for staff breaks, and she said, "Ma'am, please, sit. Let me bring you and your granddaughter some water while we sort this out. It's cold out there, and you shouldn't be standing." "Rosa," Julian's voice cut across the lobby. "That table is not for guests. She is a guest," Rosa said. Her voice shook a little, but she said it. "She came in the door. That makes her a guest. Get back to your section, or you can find out how quickly this job ends." Rosa stood there, one hand still on the back of the chair, caught between doing the right thing and keeping the job she needed. And that was the moment, the small, ordinary moment when a person decides who they are, that everything turned. Because the kitchen door had swung open. Out came a broad old man in a chef's coat, 68 years old, white-mustached, flower on his sleeve, drawn out by the noise the way old chefs are always drawn out by trouble on their floor. His name was Antoine Duval, and he had cooked in Eleanor Whitfield's kitchens for 40 years. He had started as a dishwasher in the second diner she ever opened. She had paid for his culinary school. He knew the back of her hands the way you know an old song. He saw the woman in the worn coat by the window, and his whole face changed. "Madame Whitfield," he said, and the warmth in it, the sheer delight, silenced the room more completely than any shout could have. He crossed the floor and took both her hands in his flour-dusted ones. "You did not tell me you were coming. I would have made the good bread." Then his eyes found Katie and softened further. "And this must be Katie. Look at you. Happy birthday, mon petit chou." Julian Reeve had gone very still. His eyes moved, slowly, helplessly, from the old chef holding the poor woman's hands, up to the large framed black and white photograph above his own host's stand. The young woman in the diner doorway, the same eyes, the same set of the jaw. He had walked past that photograph 1,000 times and never once looked at the small gold plate beneath it. Eleanor Whitfield, founder. 1975. "Chef Antoine," Eleanor said warmly, patting his hands. "The bread is always good, don't fuss." Then she turned, and for the first time all evening she let the room see her fully, not a woman apologizing for her coat, but the woman whose name was carved over the door. "Now," she said quietly, "I believe there's been some confusion about whether I belong here." "Ma'am," Julian's voice had lost all its polish. "Mrs. Whitfield, I had no way of knowing who you—" "You're right," Eleanor said. "You had no way of knowing who I was." Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The whole lobby had gone silent, and warm golden light lay over all of it. The marble, the flowers, the frightened manager, the trembling young server still standing by the chair. "That is exactly the point, Mr. Reeve. Everything you did tonight you did because you looked at my coat and my shoes and decided I wasn't worth a table. Not because of anything I said. Not because of how I behaved. Because of what I was wearing when I walked through the door I built." She paused. "And you did it in front of my granddaughter, on her birthday." Julian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. 50 years ago," Eleanor went on, "a man in a fine suit turned me away from a restaurant on my anniversary, and I stood on the sidewalk in the cold and promised myself that if I ever built a place of my own, no one would ever feel the way I felt that night. Every brick of the rosewood is built on that promise. Tonight you took my promise, and you broke it in my own lobby." She let that settle. "You did not fail me, Mr. Reeve. I own the building. I'll be fine. You failed every ordinary person who has ever walked in here hoping to be treated like they mattered." She held his eyes. "Your position here is over, tonight." Julian stood frozen for a long moment, the entire evening rearranging itself behind his eyes. Then, because there was nothing left to say, he set down the reservation tablet, and he walked out of the restaurant without another word. Eleanor turned next to the young hostess, Chloe, who looked as though she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "You didn't say any of it," Eleanor said. Her voice was gentler now. "But you stood beside it and you looked at the floor, because going along felt safer than speaking up. I understand that. I was young once in a job I couldn't afford to lose." She paused. "I'm not letting you go. But you're going to spend the next month learning what this place is actually for. Not the wine list. Not the dress code. The reason we open the doors at all. And I don't ever want you looking at the floor again while someone gets treated the way I was treated tonight." Chloe nodded, her eyes wet. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know, Eleanor said. Then she turned at last to Rosa, who was still standing by the little window table, one hand on the chair, having quietly risked the only job she had for a stranger in a worn coat. What's your name? Rosa, ma'am. Rosa Alvarez. Rosa. Eleanor smiled, and it was the first real smile the room had seen from her all night. You set down a full tray to pull out a chair for a woman everyone else in this room had decided to ignore. You looked your manager in the eye and told him a person who walks through the door is a guest. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How much I've spent over 50 years trying to teach people what you did tonight without being told? Rosa's eyes filled. She was cold, and it wasn't right. No, it wasn't. Eleanor took the girl's hand. As of tonight, you're no longer a server here. You're going to train as a floor manager. This floor, this room. Because I need people running my rooms who already know the thing that can't be taught. And I'd very much like it to be you. For a moment, Rosa couldn't speak at all. Then she laughed, a shaky, astonished laugh, and pressed her free hand to her mouth and nodded. Eleanor squeezed her hand once, then let it go and looked around at the whole quiet watching room. The guests, the staff, the flowers, the warm light, the photograph of a young woman in a diner doorway 50 years gone. I built this place on one rule, she said to all of them. Everyone who walks through that door gets treated like they belong. Not after you've checked their coat, not after they've proven they can afford the room. Before. Every guest. Every night. She looked at Chef Antoine, who was beaming and not bothering to hide it. I think it's time I started coming around more often, in this coat, to see who remembers that. Now, she said, and her voice warmed all the way through. My granddaughter is turning 18. Chef, I believe you offered us the good bread. Madame, said Antoine, with a small bow and enormous joy. For Katie, I make everything. 3 months later, on a quiet Tuesday evening, an elderly man came into the Rosewood in a frayed jacket and scuffed shoes alone, clutching a folded paper, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. He had saved for a long time to eat, just once, in a place like this. Rosa Alvarez met him before he reached the stand. She didn't look at his jacket. She looked at him, at the hope and the nervousness in his face, and she smiled and said it would be her honor to find him the best seat in the house. She walked him to a table by the window, the good one, and she pulled out his chair herself. Across the room, at a small corner table, an old woman in a worn wool coat watched over the rim of a coffee cup she'd been nursing for an hour, the way she used to, back when the coffee was all anyone could afford. She watched the old man's shoulders come down. She watched Rosa laugh at something he said, and she smiled to herself and said nothing, and let the place be exactly what she had always meant it to be. A person is not their coat, they are not their shoes, or the bag they carry, or the table they can afford. You find out who someone is by how they treat the person who can do nothing for them, and you find out what a place is by how it treats the person who walked in from the cold. That's not just good business. That's the whole point of opening the door at all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stick around. We tell a new one like this every week.